Welcome to Jenifer Reads. We're thrilled and excited to be a part of the Downtown Eastside 17th Annual Heart of the City Festival, which started on October 28th and will run until tomorrow, November 8th. For this very special panel discussion, we'll be introducing some guests, but first, let me introduce myself. I am Jenifer Brousseau, Wabishki Migizi Gikwe. I am Anishinaabe, Cree, and French from the Robinson-Huron Treaty in Northern Ontario, in the Canadian Shield, right at the top of Lake Huron. Joining the conversation are my co-workers, the Jenifer Reads team. We have Thule Van Den Dam and our program producer, and she's our program producer, and Irwin Oostindie, our program manager. Today, we are joined by two very special guests to explore this year's 75th anniversary of Canada liberating the Netherlands. This week, a special 1-hour documentary will be broadcast on Global BC called 75 Years Later, The Sounds of Freedom. And so we will be previewing that program, as well as the events from the Maritime Museum marking the 75th anniversary. We are joined by Mark Zuehlke, if I've said that correctly, foremost Canadian war historian, and Joost Schokkenbroek, the executive director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum and adjunct professor at SFU's Archeology department.
Great, thanks, Jen. I'm very excited for this conversation. Before we begin, I do want to remind everyone we still have books to give away. So you can read along with our daily broadcasts of youth reading Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, which you can do at our website, www.jeniferreads.com, and that's Jenifer with one N. A huge thank you to Henk Snoeke, the Dutch Consul and the Dutch Consulate of the Netherlands in Canada, for the very generous gift of these books.
Yes. Oh my gosh, this has just been such an amazing journey that we've gone on with this book. Today and tomorrow marks our last broadcast of reading Anne Frank, posted at noon daily. These readings and broadcasts will remain on our website, like the video from today's event, for educators and students across the country in the coming months and years.
And with these readings, we have some amazing youth reading this book with us, and it has been an honor for me to work with them. And I would really love to take this moment to just share them introducing themselves to you.
Hi, my name is Irwin Oostindie. I'm 24 years old, and I'm Métis and Dutch, born in Canada. I'm currently living in Vancouver for my studies.
Hi, my name is Laura Vandenberg. I am 16 years old. I am a Dutch settler living on Vancouver Island. I'm excited for this opportunity to read from Anne Frank's diary.
Hello, I'm Adrian Denhouden. I'm 13 years old. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. My father's from the Netherlands and my mother's from Australia. I like to be reading, so I'm glad to be here reading Anne Frank today.
Hi, my name is Marcella. I am from Brazil, but I live in Canada, and I'll be reading a passage of Anne Frank to you today.
Hi, my name is Yuko Masaki. I'm 24 years old, and I was born and raised in Vancouver, BC. I'm a Japanese Canadian, and I am currently studying anthropology at the University of British Columbia. Great. And I hope you enjoy this book, Anne Frank.
Oh, it's so amazing. It's like I watch it and I feel emotional. That's amazing. I'm so excited about how many young people got involved in reading and being a part of this journey of going through this book. It's just incredible. Yeah. So, with no further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you to our first guest, Mark Zuehlke. He's an award-winning author, generally considered to be Canada's foremost popular military historian. His Canadian Battle series is a highly detailed recounting of the battles and campaigns fought during World War II. In recognition of his contribution to popularizing Canadian history, Mark was awarded the 2014 Governor General's History Award for Popular Media, the Pierre Berton Award. So thank you for joining us, Mark.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here, Jenifer.
But I'd love to know, I mean, I just introduced you, but if you'd like to, do a little brief intro of yourself, that'd be great too.
I guess all I'll just say is I started out as a journalist and then migrated into being a historian. When I came into contact with a bunch of veterans in Kelowna, BC, on Remembrance Day in the Legion Hall at the Kelowna, and they were talking about a battle called the Battle of Ortona that they'd fought through. They were all ex-members of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment. And I realized I didn't know anything about this. I'd never heard of this battle. And this was back in the mid-1990s. So I thought, well, I'll go and find a book on it. And there wasn't a book. And so that it was one of those, well, there's got to be a book and then the buck stops here kind of moments. And so that's really how I got into this. And 13 books later, we have the Canadian Battle Series still progressing. We're going particularly to the Dutch Liberation. There's 3 books that are actually relevant to that terrible victory, which is about the Scheldt Estuary battles that happened. And then Forgotten Victory, which is about the battle for the Rhineland, which created a launch pad that then becomes On to Victory, which is the actual liberation of the majority of Holland that takes place. So those 3 books sort of detail all that.
Wow. Oh, so you've been busy.
Yeah.
So with this year's 75th anniversary of the Canadian liberation of the Netherlands, you were involved in a TV production called 75 Years Later, The Sounds of Freedom, which will be aired on Global TV. The show features youth reading about the war, interwoven with musical performances from the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, the Dutch Symphony Orchestra, and the Seaforth Highlanders. Viewers are transported through time as a young girl discovers a crate full of war artifacts that belonged to her great-grandfather, including handwritten letters to her great-grandmother. Let's watch the trailer for the show.
Dearest Betty, today we liberated Amsterdam. Oh, not a shot was fired.
Instead, we Seaforths just rolled in. About 1,000 of us, and the city's entire 800,000 people were waiting. For 4 miles, thousands upon thousands lined the streets.
The first night that the troops have moved in, I was leaning out the window of my little room, and I heard music, and I thought, boy, we're free.
The night before, the Canadians came in and the Germans disappeared. So the next morning, we would right away on the streets and we wanted to be on the corner where the guys came.
We had a parade in town as thank you to the Dutch people for looking after us. The Dutch all out there wiping their tears away.
The streets were lined and lined with people, and the soldiers just couldn't believe the incredible reception that they got. It was really a moment that you never forget.
Wow. I can't wait to do that. So, as a writer, what did you do to bring these stories into the television production of this?
So my role was to write the letters, basically. So there's 5 letters by a soldier, the Seaforth Highlander, who I just decided I'd call Alan. And he's writing home to his sweetheart, Betty, in Vancouver. And so we took each of the 5 letters has to do with a particular aspect of the Dutch liberation. There's one that, for example, that focuses on the Canadians bringing relief to the Dutch to relieve the hunger winter. Another one's about their entrance into Amsterdam. There's another one about when they the Seaforth Highlanders had been serving in Italy until March of 1945. They were brought up from Italy. And so their first introduction to combat in Northwest Europe occurred in the IJsselmeer area of Holland and the crossing of the IJsselmeer River. Or the IJssel River, I guess it is. And so it was an amphibious operation. And so Alan writes about, the casualties that they took. The Seaforths lost 26 men in the course of liberating Holland, and they're all buried in Holton Canadian War Cemetery. So we also had one letter is about him, Alan and some friends driving over to the Holton Canadian War Cemetery and visiting the graves there, and then being met by a whole bunch of Dutch civilians who were putting flowers on the graves and stuff, which was a very common occurrence in 1945 and continues to be, of course, perpetuated in Holton every May 4th. So bringing together, basically showing the experience of the soldier, but in the context of his interactions with the Dutch civilians.
Mm.
And his desire to get home, of course.
Amazing.
So Mark, you say that this way that you wrote it was about bringing forth the experience of the soldier. And this Jennifer Reed series is about Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. Mm-hmm. But Anne Frank and 100,000 Dutch Jews did not survive and were murdered. So why are civilian accounts and soldier accounts, Anne Frank's being included in a civilian account example of war, so important in telling these sometimes?
I think it's to understand the severity of what occurred. We have 102,000 Dutch Jews who lost their lives. 20,000 Dutch were sent to Dutch males were sent to work camps. There was more than that were sent, but 20,000 never returned. So they died in Germany in forced labor. So they have that experience. And at the same time, there's the experience of the Canadian soldiers coming into Holland. Those last 3 months, what really strikes me when you read the letters home and their memories is they were very affected by the straitened situation that the Dutch people faced. They were suddenly presented with Dutch. And it's interesting, these fellows had come from Italy, the Seaforth Highlanders, and the Italians had been suffering, but they were shocked by what was happening to the Dutch people when they came in, how bad basically the Dutch were hovering on the edge of mass starvation in the cities. It was a little different out in the countryside, but Rotterdam, Utrecht, Amsterdam, they're facing the likelihood of a mass starvation occurring, and they were really struck by that and impacted by it. And then we have, for example, Chick Goodman, who's one of the people interviewed in this production, who's a veteran, and he was present for when the Canadians liberated Westerbork at the transit camp, and so he was one of the first Canadians on site. They saw the situation that the Dutch were facing, and of course, with Anne Frank, we always know, she and her family were on the last train to leave Westerbork. If they missed that train, they would have all survived. But they were that last train rolled out. They were aborted, and they perished. And it just makes that story, so much more impactful. Just the haphazard nature of chance in a way that they ended up being on that train.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. And sites like the prison camp at Westerbork, which had many uses before and after the war years, provide a glimpse into the horror of the Holocaust, as well as the entangled history of victims of war. But what do you know about the liberating soldiers who discovered the Westerbork camp, for example?
They were quite, shaken by their experience of, they hadn't. It wasn't that they knew this camp existed. They basically arrived, and suddenly they're presented with a camp. It was the Royal Canadian Dragoons who were the first ones on site. They were an armored car unit that was basically just ranging across the countryside, trying to keep the Germans rolling, because the Germans were falling back quite fast, and they were just trying to keep pushing them along. And so then they come down a road, and there's this concentration camp, and there was no intelligence that the Canadians had that camp existed. And so suddenly they're faced with a large group of the German soldiers they actually saw fleeing into the distance. And then they ended up going in. And the first thing they did is they shared out their rations, what rations they had. And then there's just a real scramble to try and bring everybody the resources in that are needed to take care of those people. And we see that, within, I think it was 48 hours, the lead rabbi for 1st Canadian Army, who I think his last name was Case, he arrives and holds services for the people who are in the camp, which was quite he describes it as an extremely emotional experience for them, because they had not been able to have Jewish services for years.
Wow. So I'm just humbled. I'm always humbled when I'm in the presence of such knowledge, because talking to you for a very short amount of time here just feels like I'm not giving you any justice for what you could actually, the knowledge that you could impart to me. And it's funny. It's like at this point in my life, all of a sudden, I just feel like this sponge where I'm just so, I'm taking it all in. I think there was, a time of my life where maybe it didn't matter. We were in some golden era where, life was, the world was our oyster and we didn't need to know anything. And now, we've come to realize, especially in the last decade, well, especially this past year, like the importance
yes.
of, knowledge is power, and the importance of knowing all these things. So I really appreciate you sharing that knowledge with us. And I'm going to have to look into your books and do some of my own research. So get to me, Gretch. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. I would love to introduce our next guest, Dr. Joost Schokkenbroek, which I think I said that properly, the executive director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum. He brings to this institution a museum and academic background spanning over 3 decades, including chief curator of the Dutch National Maritime Museum in Amsterdam for over 26 years. Dr. Schokkenbroek holds a PhD in the maritime history from Leiden University and has published on museum collections and material culture in general, and their importance as sources for historical research, which I know a lot about. So, welcome, Joost.
Thank you so much, Jenifer. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Joost. Joost, you are currently featuring an exhibition at the museum titled Celebration 75 Years of Freedom, in honor of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands. The Dutch Liberation 2020 Canadian Society has created a temporary display chronicling the liberation of the Netherlands by Canadian Armed Forces. As a young person growing up in the Netherlands, what is your personal connection to these stories and to the exhibit?
Thank you, Thule. I was hoping that you would ask me, because it's not just professional reasons that I wanted to put up this exhibition. There are personal reasons as well. Mark already alluded to the fighting that was going on at the end of 1944, Operation Market Garden, for instance. And my mother was in Arnhem at that particular time. And I was born 17 years later, in 1961. One might say, well, 17 years, that's quite a long time. Well, we all know it isn't. So when I was growing up as a little boy, I was born in Nijmegen. When I was growing up as a little boy, at one time, you may know that we have in Nijmegen, there's this huge march for 4 days, the Vierdaagse, 4 days of 50 kilometers of marching. And when I probably was about maybe only 3 or 4 years old, my father and I was holding his big hand, he was holding my small hand. We were watching the people passing by, and way in the distance we could hear, this famous song sung by Canadian soldiers. Of course, as a 4-year-old one, I didn't realize that was a famous song sung by Canadian soldiers, but luckily my dad didn't realize. And he said, listen and look, Joost. These are the people that liberated us. These are the people who created the freedom that we are happy to enjoy on a daily basis. And here we are so many years later, almost 50 years later, 60 years later. And I, as a museum director, do have an opportunity to, in collaboration, of course, with the society, organize an exhibition to focus on the relationship between Canada and the Netherlands in a very particular, harsh, difficult, terrible time that is the Second World War. So I feel honored and humbled and privileged to be able to connect that personal experience that goes back way back when with the professional work that I try to do here in Vancouver, that is running the Vancouver Maritime Museum.
Wow. I know from my work hosting Wild Archeology on APTN, making archaeology accessible can teach young people about their own histories, which, for me has just been such a great impact to be able to have the opportunity to get in there myself, not as an archaeologist, but just as someone who auditioned for this show. And then, and then I booked it, and it's been the greatest reclamation of my life. And because, and not only just for me, it's for me to share with others, which is, what you're doing is to share with others what do you feel got you excited to spend your life in museums and learning about history? I mean, you did touch on it a little bit with what you just said, but is there anything more that really kind of opened this door for you?
Well, when I was doing my military service in the Netherlands in the early 1980s, at one time I was asked whether I was planning to go and study, and I was thinking it's either English or history, although I was fighting with my history teacher all the time in grammar school, because as opinionated as I was at the time, and things didn't change that much, I fear, I didn't agree that often with the guy. So I thought, well, I better study history so I have better arguments to share with the man. That's basically why I studied history. But during my studies at that university, I realized this is all fine and dandy, especially maritime history was absolutely fantastic. But it's mostly focused on archival documents. It's the written word as a source. And when I had a chance to go to the United States to do a 3-month internship at a museum, a private museum south of Boston, which eventually turned out into a 3-year employment for 2 jobs instead of a 3-month internship, I realized, hang on, this is the missing link. This is the missing part. I needed this to hopefully, if I may say it rather bluntly, become a more complete kind of historian. That is, in my particular field, I would say, using material culture, using sources. And guess what? That's what museums do. They provide written sources, but also non-written sources. And that's why I try to combine and build bridges between academia and museums, because I think there's so much that can be shared and should be shared between these two worlds. So that keeps me going, and that keeps me going in the museum work as well. I still have to think of myself as an academic, publishing and all that as well. At the same time, I focus on material culture and publish on material culture and the use thereof as historical sources. And now I got wonderful people at the Vancouver Maritime Museum who are doing that work. So I can continue to chat, occasionally think, and promote the museum to the outside world, and maybe less focus on content.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I've learned as I've been doing archaeology. You can be digging in the dirt and you can be pulling out artifacts, but if you don't have the connection, the ethnography, and the connection to the people and the true stories, because sometimes we're often reading accounts, from a certain perspective, whether it's a patriarchal viewpoint or whatever the viewpoint or colonial viewpoint, or and it's really so nice to go that much deeper and hear the real stories from the real people and do that part. How can museums use the power of stories to connect with their audiences? How can these artifacts become more accessible and their hidden stories more revealed?
I was so hoping that you would ask that question. There you are, you do it, because it creates a wonderful stepping stone for me to focus on the exhibition that we have. The society, the Dutch Liberation Canadian Society 2020, did a phenomenal job, especially the professors Richard Unger and Peter Moog, both affiliated with UBC, to create contents, to create 11 panels with themes and photographs and texts. And lo and behold, luckily in our collections, we do have and do have artifacts, paintings that relate to wartime Canada and Canadians being involved in the war. And we also added to the exhibition material culture, that is memorabilia from people who survived the war, people whose parents kept a diary or reserved these food coupons. You may know that everything was on ration at a certain moment in the Netherlands, food included. And there you can see the original coupons that were distributed by the Nazis in order to provide people, bread and milk and what have you. But there also are some souvenirs from Canadian soldiers. So I think when you look at the text panels, the photographs, the storylines, the themes, combined with material culture and with an interview that we have put together with Marijke Gilmore, a wonderful lady who has been living in Vancouver for quite some time, a Dutch lady. And she was a young girl when the Nazis first got into Amsterdam. And she was a little older girl, 5 years older, when the Canadians came into Amsterdam. And she talks about this in a phenomenal, wonderful, vivid, and heartfelt way. So yes, narratives do matter, and we need you and people that we know to share the knowledge. We need the artifacts, we need the documents, and all together we can create that narrative that I think will be convincing, that will be authentic, that will start make people think about the role that they might play in society nowadays. Definitely the role that Canadian forces played in liberating the Netherlands, something I think that Mark already alluded to as well, something I believe is not very well known in Canada yet. With all due respect to Mark and the wonderful publications, hopefully, Mark, you will sell many, many, many more books, because I think these stories need to be told and need to be remembered.
I think so. I mean, I agree. Both of you guys just inspire me with that knowledge, because to be honest, I keep on bringing up hosting Wild Archeology, but in 2 seasons and in being in field schools across the country, I've become obsessed with knowing more, because I went into it and actually felt very, I actually cried on the journey, because I recognized how little I knew and how little we were taught in school about our history. I think I actually probably even knew more of the history of what we're discussing now than I did of my own history of my ancestors, and my grandmother's a residential school survivor. So just thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It just inspires me to continue to continue educating myself and continue learning more about history in general, and my own especially, with such passion that you guys both have. I'd like to introduce Irwin to talk about his project before I open up a few questions for everybody. So yeah, Irwin, what are you up to?
Well, one thing that I've been up to is a project called Van Kijkduinstraat, which was a project about my dad's journey from Amsterdam during the Hunger Winter. And he walked, with a friend from Amsterdam. We talked about 20,000. I think Mark talked about 20,000 people were dying from hunger that winter. Part of the kind of Mark, was that the Germans were basically starving out the western part of the Netherlands, and the resistance had also flooded some fields as a kind of a.
That's right. A lot of it goes back to in September 1944 when the railway strike happened. The Dutch government in exile thought that the liberation was going to happen much more quickly. They called for a general strike, and the Germans' response to that general strike was to smash the strike. But then they also said about hijacking the transportation system, basically, so that no food was flowing from the other parts of Holland into the where the large cities are all concentrated in that western part. And that's when the process, you start seeing, month after month after month, the situation gets more and more dire, because there's those urban areas that were not capable of feeding themselves. They required the food to be brought from the more eastern parts of the Netherlands to feed them. So that was what happened.
So I guess my uncles had been picked up by the Germans, one to a work camp and one to a prison camp. One uncle escaped, then joined the Allies in France, part of the resistance. But my mom, my grandmother and grandfather had my dad. They were in my grandparents distributed the Waarheid, the underground newspaper. Mm-hmm. And on the ground floor, they had a 3-floor building, and the ground floor was an NSB'er, so a collaborator with the Germans. So that was the complexity of, living on your street, and you've got a collaborator with the occupiers on your ground floor, and you're working with the resistance to propagate it. So my dad at 16, he left from Kijkduinstraat and walked, and so my daughter and I reenacted that in 2016, and we visited the family, the refugee family that's living in my dad's house today. So teenage girls, same age as my daughter, and that was beautiful to kind of learn about how are refugees treated now, compared to war refugees, domestic refugees back then. So we walked across the Netherlands. This was a funny image of watching kids playing Pokemon Go in front of a hundreds-year-old armament structure. So we walked across the country, finding all these artifacts, these German artifacts. Scattered across the landscape. This was a very difficult time. We walked through the northern Veluwe forest and came upon this hiding spot where more than 100 Jewish people hid in the Verschollendorp underground. It was very, very difficult to witness that and to be on the land. I know, Mark, you've walked across a lot of the war sites and walked where these Canadian soldiers were liberating Europe. And there's a certain power when you witness it. And I think, Jenifer, you too, in your archaeology work, being on the land and witnessing, in this case, a site of horror where, unfortunately, a couple of the kids were looking for water. They'd been surviving over a year with 140 people living in these underground houses in the forest. And a German soldier saw these kids, and then most of the people were murdered. So that's still there, the Verschollendorp. And we walked across the country, crossed the Eye River, and my dad we interviewed my dad on a smartphone, and it's.
The biggest obstacle was how to get across the river, the big river. So we jumped on a truck full with volunteers, full with workers who had to go back in the nighttime, back to their own place. They worked for the Germans during the daytime. In the nighttime, people went home. So we jumped on a truck, and the workers in the truck said, when you get on a certain corner, you can jump off. The soldiers have gone to sleep in the truck. That's great. That's what we did. We went across the river. We knew we were safe in some respect. When we got to the certain corner of the road, Henry and I jumped off the truck on the back. And I remember falling on my knee, and it was damn sore, was it? We knew we had to get across there. And we came across. We did it. Hooray, hooray, hooray. We kept on walking, and we slept in a farmhouse. And the farmer fed us in the next day pannenkoek gosh, fantastic, 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 fantastic.
We encourage kids, I know when we spoke to 700 kids at Templeton High School in East Vancouver, my dad, my daughter, and myself. And what was remarkable, this is Remembrance Day 2016, is most of these kids, 2/3 of the kids in the room, all have grandparents with war stories, right? If it's not El Salvador or China or Vietnam or the Netherlands, they all have war stories. And so I think in many ways, it's an opportunity for kids to investigate their own grandparents' stories, to really teach them about history. And we walked where the Canadian soldiers walked. This is in Hoogeveen, 75 years ago. And I'll just show a video. This is where he went in Nieuw-Hollande.
Administration of Nieuw-Hollande knew about it. They told the Canadian doctors, Dutch doctors, they all knew that it was a surprise that I was still alive. Diphtheria was in bad sickness. So I was in the Canadian ambulance. And one thing that I remember was the smell of blood and chewing gum and cigarette smoke. Quite something, isn't there, when you think about it. Occasionally we had to stop because they didn't know if the area they went through was liberated by the Canadians or by the Dutch on the ground. We had about fighting still, the Canadians and the Germans, and there was bitter fighting going on there, as a matter of fact. One of the biggest fights was in Groningen during the end of the war. It was very tough. The Germans didn't surrender. They did not surrender. And they had a Hitlerjugend. Boys of 14, 15 years out in the field fighting. The Canadians and the Polish and on the ground, they were together. But the Germans were still, they were bitter fighters. They were very good soldiers, the Germans. I smelled the lilacs. And the windows were all broken, shattered to pieces. The SS had kind of surrendered finally, and I smelled the lilacs.
This goes to the earlier comments about history that Joost his disagreements with his history teacher. For too long, history has been taught in a kind of almost a static kind of thing. It's like, so it's not a living experience. And what I've been trying to do in all my work is make it so that bring the intensity of detail and what's happening day to day so that the reader feels they're almost walking with the soldier and soldiers. And to do that, of course, you go back and forth from dozens and dozens of soldiers to keep the camera alive, basically. And then the history stops being this abstract thing in the past, and it becomes something that's alive and resonant for everyone who's involved in it today. And that's the only way you engage, particularly young people, with the history is if it's just an old, we're looking back on 1944. That's almost like it's going to be 200 years ago in 20 years. It's hard to get young people to say, well, this matters, this resonates. But if you get them to see, here's a 19-year-old and he's, a year or 2 years older than you were. And he's afraid, and he's in a marshy open area like the ones Irwin had been showing. He's got to walk across that, and he may die out there. And he knows that. He's got that fear in him. That makes it, more resonant. Then you can identify as a young person that his experience doesn't mirror yours, but you can understand his experience, and that brings the history to life.
Well, the connection of stories from past until present can actually be empowering. And that's the thing, like as I go on this journey and as I'm outdoors doing wild archaeology and I'm digging and I'm doing archaeology, I recognize the importance of telling these stories because the narrative needs to be shifted. It's a story that people don't. The young women need to be told the stories about the matriarchs that were here on Turtle Island before colonization. They need to understand the strength of our women, and so my goal in telling history is for that empowerment, because I feel like if we know about the past and we're able to see reflections of ourselves, or these young people to see reflections of themselves in young people like Anne Frank, it's empowering. It's a way to empower us to move forward as a people, because for the longest time, the goal of residential school system was to basically break the Indian out of the child. And so I grew up very much with that feeling of not feeling like I wanted to be who I was. Total identity crisis. Mm-hmm. So knowing my history actually lifts that identity crisis from me. And so, what you guys are doing is so empowering to every generation that is coming after you, because by you pulling these stories out and telling these stories and telling history from the perspectives that you're telling them from, it's just really important. I actually wanted to pose a question, just to open it up to whomever. But back in the Second World War, 3,000 Indigenous men volunteered to liberate Western Europe, but only to come back as second-class citizens. They lived under an apartheid pass system in Canada, and their sacrifices are largely unknown today. And regarding the Dutch, they liberated only to continue their bloody occupation of Indonesia. It seems that Canada and the Netherlands share more than stories of liberation, but also occupation. So how can these hidden stories become mainstream so dominant narratives can become more genuine?
I think what we've got to do is basically make those stories mainstream. For example, Tommy Prince was a First Nations soldier who was the most decorated First Nations soldier of World War II. And he was a classic example. He returned to Canada, and he initially was fairly successful, but then the businesses that he set up a business and then it failed. And then he started, he was struggling with alcohol issues and things like that. And, that sort of tragic kind of, not being able to find out how to fit back into the society. Whereas as a soldier, he had, everything felt right. And he ultimately said it was only when I put on a uniform did I feel like a man again. And so the Korean War comes and he puts on a uniform and goes off to war again. That kind of, when you come back and you've been in a repressed society, a repressed people, and, nothing really changed. It's like, fine, it's nice to have you back now. Go back onto the reserves and carry on. Those stories need to be brought forward. I'd love to see a movie made about Tommy Prince because it's such a compelling story. Of course, getting movies made in Canada is not the easiest thing. But if we could show his journey and how it got to where it did. It's not a happy story, but it then, people can't walk away from the story. Then they have to face it and confront it, whether you're First Nations or whether you're just an old white guy like me.
Yeah, no. And I'm glad that you said that and brought him up. And I'm actually I'm going to do a little bit of research on him now, because that sounds like a really great movie idea.
Looks like Joost has his hand up.
Okay.
Yeah, Jenifer, if I may, just to add to what Mark just said. As I mentioned earlier, I have the privilege that I'm a director of a museum. A museum is a public institution. It's an institution that's luckily still funded for the major part by taxpayers. And even if that would not be the case, I feel that as a public institution, we have a responsibility a social responsibility to tell stories, to inform people, to start dialogues, to have people get informed and create discourses or add to discourses that are, important things in our communities. Having said all this, I feel that our museum should become more than it has been so far, a podium for the indigenous voices, plural, not one voice, voices, and all the different permutations. And I also know, having come to Canada only 3 years ago, for me, it's a lifelong learning. It's a daily learning experience to realize I have to be extremely humble. All we can do is create that podium where tens of thousands of people on a yearly basis pass by, where hundreds of thousands of people use the websites and read the website. Create a podium for these stories that you refer to, for these stories to be told. Am I going to tell that story? No. That would be a new form of colonialism that I don't want to manifest, don't want to show, don't want to get into. Am I here to reach out to those people in indigenous communities who would love to see us tell these narratives? No doubt in my mind that I am. I am reaching out via you, via Irwin, via Thule, via this wonderful program. Please share with us what it is you want to share. And we will be extremely humble and provide opportunities. That's all I can say.
Awesome. That's amazing. That's truth and reconciliation right there. Mm-hmm. And I mean, and it's important that we even bring that, truth and reconciliation up, because it's just overstated words. But I mean, as we talk about this liberation, and as these narratives and these stories are being told, and we are in this time, we're even in the news more recently, our treaty rights are being overstepped. What can you speak into what you see happening in Canada, as you guys have done all of these studies and you've studied history and, we're celebrating this liberation. What do you feel about, the liberation of Indigenous people in Canada?
Well, I think that's an interesting point. I've been, now that we have a new NDP majority, I really hope they go back to something like the Site C Dam, for example, and properly negotiate with the Treaty 8 people up there. Governments and all of us as citizens who are not Aboriginal or First Nations, we have a responsibility, I think, to not assist or anything like that, but be there and ready to listen to the stories and advocacy that's coming forward. I look at people like yourself, Jenifer, and you're on, you've set out on a journey now of discovery that's going to lead you to an empowerment to be able to, as knowledge is power, and then the more you get the knowledge, the more you can create a power base that you can work from to make things better for your people, basically.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
May I add to this, Jennifer, also to relate to your question? About a year and a half ago, we started a major project funded by the federal government. It's a virtual exhibition program or project. That's something that we do together with the UBC and with a number of First Nations, especially on the island. And it's focusing on George Vancouver and his voyage to the Vancouver area. Not from George Vancouver's point of view, but from the various Indigenous people's point of view. That's one thing that we try to do in order to change the perspective, as you were so eloquently brought to the table here. It's about perspectives. Is yours better than mine? No, I don't. Well, maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. That's not really the point. It adds to knowledge. It adds to an understanding. It adds to respect, mutual respect for each other's position, background, opinions. Another project that we are on the brink of doing, that will be next year, hopefully, is a canoe project together with Anne Phillips and some other people who have been working extremely hard with First Nations people to construct canoes. As you may know, the canoe building is something that seems to be more, something that's almost exclusively known to former generations. The new generations don't know that much about it, as it turns out. And we documented not only the building of canoes, but also want to show the results of the canoe building project in our museum in a way, in an attempt to indicate to our audiences that this is basically going back to the roots of Vancouver, Canada, and maritime history. That's the canoe as a symbol. And that, I think, could be considered, hopefully you agree, and if you don't agree, you tell me, that could be considered part of reconciliation as well, that a museum like ours, fairly white guy kind of museum, continues to reach out and work with other parties in order to tell stories that so much are theirs and should be ours.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's how you become an ally, by holding that space to actually tell the real stories and the real families being a part of that, back to the ethnography mentioned earlier and the importance of, and for me as an artist, there is a great beauty in being able to use that as a medium to continue moving these stories forward. I just finished writing a feature film. I toured with a play that I wrote over a decade ago about suicide, and I've taken it into Indigenous communities and high schools throughout Western Canada. And I've since written it into a feature film. But now that I've done something, as big as that, I know that to tackle something, like telling a story through film, are true stories. And I just again, as I've said before, you guys are inspiring me in that way. I've already been considering going back to university to get a degree, because as we keep on saying, knowledge is power. And it's actually something that I say in the commercial for Wild Archeology, that knowledge is power. So I just got to follow suit with that, because I think, it's very, very important that these narratives get shifted. And I often say that I don't get offended when the majority of Canadians are ignorant about their understanding of our history, because that was perpetuated. It was perpetuated to me in when I was in school, and I grew up very ignorant myself. It's throughout my life and throughout the opportunities that Creator has sent my way that I have had the opportunity to reclaim who I am as an Indigenous woman on this land, and to stand for her, and that's what we have to do right now in this time, is we need to stand and actually take care of the planet, as we know. So we're talking today about Canada liberating the Netherlands 75 years ago. And today also happens to be the day of the U.S. election results. If you could help us position these big events on how democracy is shaped and stories are told. For example, does history repeat itself, and do we learn from it? And how do we learn from it?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think the jury's still out on what is happening in the U.S. We've got Joe Biden being the president. That's confirmed. But there's a huge divide in that nation now. You look at the 60-some million people voted for Donald Trump, 70-some million voted for Joe Biden. Is there going to be an acceptance of the election results? Are we going to have riots in the streets? Nobody knows. I guess, you do look back and see there are linkages back to the origins of World War II that you can sort of see, particularly the rise of the Nazism in Germany. And I'm getting probably way too political here. And you start to, you do worry about the future of a country in which there's such a divide between people and so much built up anger and hostility back and forth between those peoples. And I think this next year is going to be a very important year in the history of the United States, particularly. And, then we all have to recover from the pandemic, which is like a whole nother thing.
Yeah. If I may, I think when we look at the developments today, maybe two things that I would like to say about this in response to your question, Jenifer. Firstly, I feel, but that's me, the blunt Dutchman shooting from the hip. I feel that today what we've witnessed, and here I go, Mark, I might be more political than you want me to be, but I think it's a victory for democracy. And I think that's something that we are talking about today as well when it comes to 75 years of liberation of the Netherlands, of Europe. It was a victory of democracy eventually, partly for a very important part for the Netherlands, at least partly forced by Canadian forces. When it comes to learning from history, I never forget, quite recently we had an exhibition on Roald Amundsen and how he managed to beat Scott when it comes to reaching the center of the South Pole of Antarctica. What did the guy do? He went to the Arctic first. And what did he do in the Arctic? He listened. He listened to the people living, working, dying there for thousands and thousands of years. And what did this guy do, Amundsen? He listened to them. He used that knowledge in order to perform so well from, say, political and other points of view, perform so well for the Norwegian government in Antarctica. And he beat Scott. What did others do? They did not even go to the Arctic to prepare themselves well. It might be sounds like a strange example, but yes, we can learn from history by listening, by seeing how people who are best suited to inform us, how people have been able to cope with matters and take those lessons with us and hopefully eventually share what we learn based on those lessons with new generations.
Love that. I definitely have been spending a lot of time on the land and near the waters, knowing that's my first and foremost governing bodies. I listen to the animals, and the animals will let us know what we need to do. That's what the ancestors have been doing for a long time. So we need to be paying attention to the animals, and making sure that we're continuing to be stewards of the land. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us today.
You're more than welcome.
I don't know if my other two co-hosts have anything more that they'd like to share or ask before we wrap this up. Anythings?
Well, I've been listening very closely. This was incredible, and I was reminded of a metaphor that Rebecca Solnit uses in one of her books. I don't remember which one, but she writes about the rowboat and how you have to look behind you. Like, you have to look at where you're coming from in order to move forward. Mm-hmm. And the kind of generosity and spaciousness that's afforded when you embrace uncertainty, but you also embrace hindsight.
Yeah.
Wisdom shared by our youngest panelist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today. Don't forget, we still have books to give away. So head to our website, www.jeniferreads.com. That's Jenifer with one N. And again, if you happen to miss anything, don't worry, because everything will be up on the website and it'll be available to watch at your leisure. It's been a pleasure and so enlightening to speak with you, Mark and Joost. And thanks Thule and Irwin and all of our viewers for tuning in. Gitchimiigwech from the top of Lake Huron to you guys on the West Coast, and to wherever our viewers are, Gitchimiigwech.
And for our viewers in the Vancouver area.
Yes, well, I would love to just very briefly. Yes, we have the pleasure of welcoming and hosting Mark's talk coming Monday. It's very well advertised here on the screen. Thank you so much for doing so, Thule and Irwin. And when it comes to our exhibition, I invite each and every one of you, please come over to the museum. We're open Thursday through Sundays, 10 to 5, and the exhibition will be there until the 16th. So the 15th of November is the last day for you to come over to the museum. Please do so. We welcome you wholeheartedly, and we need you desperately in these dire circumstances and times that we're living in. Thank you so much for hosting this wonderful event again. And what a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenifer. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.